All right, so today we're diving into Ammunition Hill. Most people probably know it as this big, battle site from the Six-Day War.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to it than just the trenches and the tunnels.
Oh, absolutely.
It's really like a perfect example of how personal memories end up shaping and sometimes even clashing with how a country decides to tell its own story, its national narrative.
It's incredible, how Ammunition Hill itself,
right
from the moment the war ended, became this battleground, but not a physical one.
Yeah.
A battleground for memory,
Yeah.
for how we choose to remember the past.
Right, so it's almost like even after the fighting stopped,
Yeah.
the fight continued, but on this other level, on the level of meaning and memory. So let's go back to the very beginning, like right after the fighting stopped in June of 67.
Right.
What was happening at Ammunition Hill in those first few days and weeks?
Well, you got to picture this. The dust is still settling. Literally, right? The echoes of gunfire are still like fresh in the air.
Well,
And already the soldiers, they feel this urge, this deep need to create a memorial.
so even before anything official, anything planned, they already sense that this place needs to be remembered.
Exactly, yeah. And what I find remarkable is that they weren't just, honoring their own fallen comrades, the Israeli soldiers. They actually put up a monument to the Jordanian soldiers who died defending that very position.
Wow, that's...
It's a testament to, I think, the rawness of the emotions in those immediate aftermath of battle, that very human need to remember, to honor the dead, even in the midst of chaos.
It makes you realize how primal that impulse is, that urge to remember. But I read that things got complicated pretty quickly. Didn't the city have other plans for Ammunition Hill?
They did.
Yeah.
So you've got the soldiers, you've got the grieving families who are starting to come to the site.
Right.
And they're picturing a place for quiet reflection, a place for personal remembrance.
Yeah.
But the Jerusalem municipality, they saw something else. They saw prime real estate, a perfect spot for a brand new neighborhood.
Wait, a neighborhood? You mean like apartment buildings and stuff right on top of a battlefield?
That was the plan. Can you imagine? Talk about a clash of visions.
That's a huge disconnect.
It became this whole battle of memory, Imagine the heartbreak, the tension. There's this one quote from a bereaved parent that really stuck with me. He said the bulldozers would only pass over the bodies of grieving parents.
Oh, wow.
That's how strongly people felt about preserving the sanctity of that site.
Yeah, you can hear the pain in his voice, even all these years later. That personal connection to place, it's powerful. So how did the memorial end up winning out? Did someone step in, some kind of leader?
That's where it gets really interesting. You have this man, Yitzhak Feniger. He lost his son on Ammunition Hill.
Oh, wow.
And he basically becomes this one-man crusade to make sure the site's never forgotten.
So this personal tragedy, it fuels this whole mission.
Totally. And he's not messing around. He writes directly to Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister at the time.
Wow, directly to Dayan.
Urging him, pleading with him to recognize and preserve the honor of Ammunition Hill.
That's gutsy. To go straight to the top like that.
And it worked. Just a year later, in '68, Ammunition Hill is officially declared a national memorial site.
It's interesting because that same year, they also made Jerusalem Day, marking the reunification of the city.
Right.
They made that a national holiday.
You're picking up on something really important here. It's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Those two events, they're connected. They highlight how personal memory, like Feniger's fight, gets woven into this larger national narrative.
So the way we remember Ammunition Hill, it's not just about that one battle. It's also about how Israel tells the story of the Six-Day War, of itself, really. So many layers of meaning all coming together in this one place. And that's just the beginning, right? Because the story of Ammunition Hill, the way it's been remembered,
Absolutely.
it doesn't end there. It keeps evolving.
Oh.
It's like in those early years, the story they were telling about Ammunition Hill, it focused on one very specific part of the battle.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. Early on, the memorialization, it really zeroed in on the paratroopers and how brave they were.
Which, it makes sense. They were the ones who actually captured the position.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Other units, they fought like hell in that battle for Jerusalem too.
Right.
But you wouldn't necessarily get that from how Ammunition Hill is presented, at least not at first. It became like the symbol of the fight for the city, even though it was only one piece of a much bigger, more complicated story.
I get that, though. One story, one image, it captures people's imaginations. It makes it easier to, grasp onto.
For sure. And then you have the museum opening in '75. They plant those olive trees on the grounds, and it all just, feeds into that one image.
Mm.
And then on top of that, there's the song.
Oh, yeah, Ammunition Hill, right.
That's the one. I bet you anyone who was living in Israel back then, the 70s and 80s, they still know that song by heart.
Oh, I'm sure they do. We were 120. We returned 40.
Powerful stuff. And those lyrics, they did a lot to shape how everyone understood what happened. Like, when you hear that 120 return 40, it hits you hard, the sacrifice.
The thing incredibly moving.
And we're basically mythologizing the event,
yeah.
making it larger than life.
Yeah, but for the families of the soldiers who were actually there, who fought and died,
Right.
it wasn't just a story, it wasn't just a song on the radio, it was like their lives.
Of course, it was personal.
Yeah.
And for them, Ammunition Hill, it held a different kind of weight entirely. Some families, they found comfort in going there, to be close to the memories.
Yeah, I can see that.
But then others, it was just too much. Too painful to even go near the place.
I can't even imagine.
It's hard to wrap your head around, honestly. And the research I looked at, they talk about how those early ceremonies they held at Ammunition Hill, they weren't just about celebrating a victory. They were about the pain, about the loss. It was very raw.
So even though they're making it this national memorial, that personal connection, it's still there, very much present.
Yeah, totally. Those two things, the personal and the national, they were very closely linked at Ammunition Hill, at least in those early years. But things start to shift as we move into the 90s.
How so?
Well, the way Ammunition Hill was remembered starts to change. And it's kind of like how the actual landscape there changed after the fighting. They had to reshape the whole area.
Interesting comparison. So what changed about how they thought about the site?
They broadened the scope. So before, it was all about the paratroopers, right? But now they're trying to include all the different units that were part of that fight for Jerusalem. It's subtle, but it's a big shift.
It's like they're trying to tell a more complete story, bring in those voices that hadn't been heard as much.
And they start adding things to the site, like artifacts from '48, from the War of Independence.
Oh, wow.
They even change up some of the museum exhibits. It's like they're trying to show that Ammunition Hill is part of this much longer story, this long fight for Jerusalem.
Making it more relevant to more people, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're also making a real effort to reach out to Jewish communities in other countries, the diaspora.
So it's not just an Israeli story anymore, it's a Jewish story.
Exactly. The new leadership at Ammunition Hill, they really wanted people to see it less as this one battle and more about a shared identity, a global Jewish identity.
So it's about connecting to something bigger than yourself, bigger than any one event.
Exactly. And this shift, it happened at the same time that people were starting to pay more attention to personal stories, how important they are, even within these big historical narratives.
So they're thinking about how to weave those individual voices into the bigger picture of Ammunition Hill.
Exactly. The new museum, they make it a point to showcase the experiences of individual soldiers. They have this whole hall of fallen soldiers with their personal belongings, things they carried with them. And they started this thing called the Fighters Tell Project, where they're recording the stories of veterans, getting them down for history. So now you've got these individual voices, these personal stories. They become a bigger part of what Ammunition Hill is.
It sounds like a really powerful project, but I'm sensing a but coming.
Well, not everyone loved these changes. Some people, even though they were well-intentioned, some people felt like it was almost too much. Like, by focusing so much on these individual stories, they were losing sight of the big picture, the historical event itself.
So they're worried that the focus on individuals might overshadow the bigger picture.
Exactly. And there were others who worried that it made Ammunition Hill feel less important as a national symbol, that it was becoming too focused on individual stories and not enough on what it meant for Israel as a whole.
So what's the answer then? Is there a right way to balance these things, personal memories and the national story, without one taking over the other?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
That's what's so fascinating about memory, about how we tell stories about the past. There's not always a clear right answer. It's messy, it's complicated, and it never stops changing. And that brings us right up to today, to Ammunition Hill now, still grappling with these questions.
So here we are all these years later, and Ammunition Hill is still this powerful place, a place where people go to connect with history.
It really is.
But it sounds like the history they're connecting with, it's even more, layered and complicated than it was even just a few decades ago.
You're right. In fact, some of the research I was reading, it even mentioned that there's still debate. Debate over whether the official narrative of the battle, whether that's even completely accurate.
Wait, you mean like even the basic facts of what happened during the fighting?
Well, it's like anything else. The more we learn, the more we try to understand something, the messier it gets. New information comes to light, people start to share perspectives that maybe hadn't been heard before, and we have to figure out what it all means.
I guess we like to think of history as being set in stone, but it's really not, is it?
Not at all. And that's what's so interesting about this whole thing. It's not just about what happened back then, but about how we make sense of it now, in the present.
Right. Like that quote from the historian who was trying to write this more, balanced account of the battle. He said, "It wasn't just about what happened, but how we remember it."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of remembering things, how we choose to remember, it's pretty fascinating how Ammunition Hill itself has changed over time. It's not just a memorial site anymore.
Yeah, I was reading about that. They've got like this whole leadership institute there now.
Yep, you read that right. They actually run leadership training programs right there on the grounds of Ammunition Hill.
That's wild. And it's not just for soldiers or like military people, right?
Nope, they have programs for all kinds of groups, even businesses and stuff.
I wonder what that's like to be like learning about leadership in a place that's so steeped in, military history.
It's an interesting question. It makes you think about how they see Ammunition Hill now. Is it still mostly about the past, about remembering that specific battle?
Right.
Or are they trying to use it to shape the future, to inspire people, to be leaders?
Almost like Ammunition Hill is kind of this bridge between the past and the present, maybe even the future.
That's a good way to put it. And what really struck me is that even with all of this, all the changes, the debate, the expanded mission, people are still drawn to Ammunition Hill.
Oh, which is amazing when you think about it. It's not like it's just a tourist attraction. It's a place that holds real weight, real meaning.
Right. It's not just people who remember the war either. The research talked about all kinds of visitors, young people, tourists, soldiers who weren't even born back then.
So what do you think it is about Ammunition Hill that still speaks to people, even after all these years?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think it's a few things. On one level, there's the power of the place itself.
Yeah, you can't really deny that.
I mean, you're standing right there where it happened. You see the trenches, you touch the walls, and you can still see the bullet holes.
Wow.
It's one thing to read about it in a book, but to actually be there.
Right. It makes it real.
It makes it real. But even beyond that, I think it's the stories. All those stories, those personal stories that have become such a central part of how people experience Ammunition Hill. The stories about courage, about loss, about resilience.
And then those are things that everyone can connect with, right? No matter who you are, where you come from.
Exactly. Those are universal themes. They go way beyond one battle, one country, one moment in time.
And that brings us back to what this whole deep dive has been about.
How our personal memories shape the way we tell stories about the past.
Exactly. How we try to find meaning in those stories. How we use them to make sense of the world around us. And I think Ammunition Hill, it's like this perfect example of that struggle. Of how personal memories and the way a whole country creates its own narrative.
Right.
How those things can sometimes be at odds with each other.
It's messy. It's complicated.
Yeah, but it's also what makes history so fascinating, right? If we had all the answers, it wouldn't be worth exploring.
I completely agree. And it makes you think, if we're seeing this at Ammunition Hill, this shift towards personal stories being more and more important,
Right.
it makes you wonder, is that happening in other places too? Are we seeing that all over the world at other memorial sites in other countries?
That's a great question, one that I definitely don't have the answer to, but it's something to think about, to explore further. Sadly, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But hopefully this has given everyone a lot to, to chew on.
I hope so.
To think about how we remember the past, how those memories shape us, and what those memories mean for the future.
Well said.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.